Chapter 2, Part 2 of Aircraft and Submarines by Willis J. Abbot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. The Earliest Flying Men, Part 2. After the success of the ascension from the Champs de Mars, the demand at once arose for an ascension by a human being. It was a case of calling for volunteers. The experiments already made showed clearly enough that the balloon would rise high in air. Who would risk his life soaring 1,000 feet or more above the earth in a flimsy bag, filled with hot air or inflammable gas, without means of directing its course or bringing it with certainty and safety back to a landing place? It was a hard question, and it is interesting to note that it was answered not by a soldier or sailor, not by an adventurer or devil-may-care spirit, but by a grave and learned professor of physical science, Pilatre de Rosières. Presently he was joined in his enterprise by a young man of the fashionable world and sporting tastes, the Marquis d'Arlandes. Aristocratic Paris took up aviation in the last days of the 18th century, precisely as the American leisure class is taking it up in the first days of the 19th. The balloon for this adventure was bigger than its predecessors, and for the first time a departure was taken from the spherical variety, the gas bag being 74 feet high and 48 feet in diameter. Like the first Montgolfier balloons, it was to be inflated with hot air, and the car was well packed with bundles of fuel with which the two aeronauts were to fill the iron brazier when its fires went down. The instinct for art and decoration, so strong in the French mind, had been given full play by the constructors of this balloon, and it was painted with something of the gorgeousness of a circus poster. A tremendous crowd packed the park near Paris, whence the ascent was made. Always the spectacle of human lives in danger has been a morbid attraction for curiosity seekers, and we have seen in our own days throngs attracted to aviation congresses quite as much in the expectation of witnessing some fatal disaster as to observe the progress made in man's latest conquest over nature. But in this instance the occasion justified the widest interest. It was an historic moment, more epoch-making than those who gathered in that field in the environs of Paris could have possibly imagined. For in the clumsy, gaudy bag, rolling and tossing above a smoky fire, lay the fundamentals of those great airships that, perfected by the persistence of Count Zeppelin, have crossed angry seas, breasted fierce winds, defied alike the blackest nights and the thickest fogs to rain their messages of death on the capital of a foe. Contemporary accounts of this first ascension are but few, and those that have survived have come down to us in but fragmentary form. It was thought needful for two to make the ascent, for the car or basket which held the fire hung below the open mouth of the bag, and the weight of a man on one side would disturb the perfect equilibrium which it was believed would be essential to a successful flight. The Marquis d'Arlandes, in a published account of the brief flight, which sounds rather as if the two explorers of an unknown element were not free from nervousness, writes: "Our departure was at 54 minutes past 1, and occasioned little stir among the spectators. Thinking they might be frightened and stand in need of encouragement, I waved my arm." This solicitude for the fears of the spectators, standing safely on solid earth while the first aeronauts sailed skywards, is characteristically Gallic. The Marquis continues: "Monsieur de Rosières cried, 'You are doing nothing and we are not rising.' I stirred the fire and then began to scan the river, but Pilatre again cried, 'See the river, we are dropping into it.' We again urged the fire, but still clung to the river bed. Presently I heard a noise in the upper part of the balloon which gave a shock as though it had burst. I called to my companion, 'Are you dancing?' The balloon by this time had many holes burnt in it, and using my sponge I cried that we must descend. My companion, however, explained that we were over Paris and must now cross it. Therefore, raising the fire once more, we turned south till we passed Luxembourg, when, extinguishing the flames, the balloon came down spent and empty." If poor Pilatre played the part of a rather nervous man in this narrative, he had the nerve still to go on with his aeronautical experiments to the point of death. In 1785 he essayed the crossing of the English Channel in a balloon of his own design, in which he sought to combine the principles of the gas and hot air balloons. It appears to have been something like an effort to combine nitroglycerin with an electric spark. At any rate, the dense crowds that thronged the coast near Boulogne to see the start of the Charles Montgolfier, as the balloon was named after the originators of the rival systems, saw it, after half an hour's drift out to sea, suddenly explode in a burst of flame. De Rozier and a friend who accompanied him were killed. A monument still recalls their fate, which, however, is more picturesquely recorded in the signs of sundry inns and cafés of the neighborhood, which offers refreshment in the name of Les Aviateurs Perdus. Thereafter experimenters with balloons multiplied amazingly. The world thought the solution of the problem of flight had been found in the gas bag. Within 2 months a balloon capable of lifting 18 tons and carrying 7 passengers ascended 3,000 feet at Lyon, and, though sustaining a huge rent in the envelope because of the expansion of the gas at that height, returned to earth in safety. The fever ran from France to England, and in 1784, only a year after the first Montgolfier experiments, Lunardi, an Italian aeronaut, made an ascension from London which was viewed by King George III. And his ministers, among them William Pitt. But the early enthusiasm for ballooning quickly died down to mere curiosity. It became apparent to all that merely to rise into the air, there to be the helpless plaything of the wind, was but a useless and futile accomplishment. Pleasure seekers and mountebanks used balloons for their own purposes, but serious experimenters at once saw that if the invention of the balloon was to be of the slightest practical value, some method must be devised for controlling and directing its flight. To this end some of the brightest intellects of the world directed their efforts, but it is hardly overstating the case to say that more than a century passed without any considerable progress toward the development of a dirigible balloon. But even at the earliest time it was evident enough that the Quaker philosopher from the American colonies, not yet the United States, whose shrewd and inquiring disposition made him intellectually one of the foremost figures of his day, foresaw clearly the great possibilities of this new invention. In letters to Sir Joseph Banks, then president of the Royal Society of London, Franklin gave a lively account of the first 3 ascensions, together with some comments, at once suggestive and humorous, which are worth quoting. "Some think," he wrote of the balloon, "progressive motion on the earth may be advanced by it, and that a running footman, or a horse slung and suspended under such a globe, so as to have no more of weight pressing the earth with their feet than perhaps 8 or 10 pounds, might with a fair wind run in a straight line across countries as fast as that wind, and over hedges, ditches, and even waters. It has been even fancied that in time people will keep such globes anchored in the air, to which by pulleys they may draw up game to be preserved in the cool and water to be frozen when ice is wanted, and that to get money it will be contrived by running them up in an elbow chair a mile high for a guinea, etc., etc." With his New England lineage Franklin could hardly have failed of this comparison. A few months since the idea of witches riding through the air upon a broomstick and that of philosophers upon a bag of smoke would have appeared equally impossible and ridiculous. Today, when aircraft are the eyes of the armies in the greatest war of history, and when it appears that, with the return of peace, the conquest of the air for the ordinary uses of man will be swiftly completed, Franklin's good-humored plea for the fullest experimentation is worth recalling. And the touch of piety with which he concludes his argument is a delightful example of the whimsical fashion in which he often undertook to bolster up a mundane theory with a reference to things supernatural. "I am sorry this experiment is totally neglected in England, where mechanic genius is so strong. I wish I could see the same emulation between the two nations as I see between the two parties here. Your philosophy seems to be too bashful. In this country we are not so much afraid of being laughed at. If we do a foolish thing, we are the first to laugh at it ourselves, and are almost as much pleased with a bon mot or a chanson that ridicules well the disappointment of a project as we might have been with its success. It does not seem to me a good reason to decline prosecuting a new experiment which apparently increases the power of man over matter till we can see to what use that power may be applied. When we have learnt to manage it, we may hope some time or other to find uses for it, as men have done for magnetism and electricity, of which the first experiments were mere matters of amusement. This experience is by no means a trifling one, and may be attended with important consequences that no one can foresee. We should not suffer pride to prevent our progress in science. Beings of a rank and nature far superior to ours have not disdained to amuse themselves with making and launching balloons, otherwise we should never have enjoyed the light of those glorious objects that rule our day and night, nor have had the pleasure of riding around the sun ourselves upon the balloon we now inhabit. B. Franklin. The earliest experimenters thought that oars might be employed to propel and direct a balloon. The immediate failure of all endeavors of this sort led them, still pursuing the analogy between a balloon and a ship at sea, to try to navigate the air with sails. This again proved futile. It is impossible for a balloon or airship to tack or maneuver in a way by sail power. It is in fact a monster sail itself, needing some other power than the wind to make headway or steerage way against the wind. The sail device was tested only to be abandoned. Only when a trail rope dragging along the ground or sea is employed does the sail offer sufficient resistance to the wind to sway the balloon's course this way or that, and a trailer is impracticable when navigating great heights. For these reasons the development of the balloon lagged until Count Zeppelin and M. Santos Dumont consecrated their fortunes, their inventive minds, and their amazing courage to the task of perfecting a dirigible. In a book necessarily packed with information concerning the rapid development of aircraft which began in the last decade of the 19th century and was enormously stimulated during the War of all the World, the long series of early experiments with balloons must be passed over hastily. Though interesting, historically these experiments were futile. Beyond having discovered what could not be done with a balloon, the practitioners of that form of aeronautics were little further along in 1898 when Count Zeppelin came along with the first plan for a rigid dirigible than they were when Blanchard, in 1786, seizing a favorable gale, drifted across the English Channel to the French shore, together with Dr. Jeffries, an American. It was just 124 years later that Blériot, a Frenchman, made the crossing in an airplane independently of favoring winds. It had taken a century and a quarter to attain this independence. In a vague way the earliest balloonists recognized that power, independent of wind, was necessary to give balloons steerage way and direction. Steam was in its infancy during the early days of ballooning, but the efforts to devise some sort of an engine light enough to be carried into the air were untiring. Within a year after the experiments of the Montgolfier brothers, the suggestion was made that the explosion of small quantities of gun cotton and the expulsion of the resulting gases might be utilized in some fashion to operate propelling machinery. Though the suggestion was not developed to any useful point, it was of interest as forecasting the fundamental idea of the gas engines of to day which have made aviation possible. That is, the creation of power by a series of explosions within the motor. In the effort to make balloons dirigible one of the first steps was to change the form from the spherical or pear-shaped bag to a cylindrical or cigar shape. This device was adopted by the brothers Robert in France as early as 1784. Their balloon further had a double skin or envelope, its purpose being partly to save the gas which percolated through the inner skin, partly to maintain the rigidity of the structure. As gas escapes from an ordinary balloon, it becomes flabby and can be driven through the air only with extreme difficulty. In the balloon of the Robert brothers, air could from time to time be pumped into the space between the two skins, keeping the outer envelope always fully distended and rigid. In later years this idea has been modified by incorporating in the envelope one large or a number of smaller balloons or balloonets, into which air may be pumped as needed. The shape too has become approximate that of a fish rather than a bird, in the case of balloons at least. The head of a cod and the tail of a mackerel was the way Marie Monge, the French aeronaut, described it. Though most apparent in dirigible balloons, this will be seen to be the favorite design for airplanes if the wings be stripped off, and the body and tail alone considered. Complete, these machines are not unlike a flying fish. In England, Sir George Cayley, as early as 1810, studied and wrote largely on the subject of dirigibles, but, though the English call him the father of British aeronautics, his work seems to have been rather theoretical than practical. He did indeed demonstrate mathematically that no lifting power existed that would support the cumbrous steam engine of that date, and tried to solve this dilemma by devising a gas engine and an explosive engine. With one of the latter, driven by a series of explosions of gunpowder, each in a separate cell set off by a detonator, he equipped a flying machine which attained a sufficient height to frighten Cayley's coachman, whom he had persuaded to act as pilot. The rather unwilling aviator, fearing a loftier flight, jumped out and broke his leg, though by virtue of this martyrdom his name should surely have descended to fame with that of Cayley. It has been lost, together with all records of any later performances of the machine, which unquestionably embodied some of the basic principles of our modern aircraft, though it antedated the first of these by nearly a century. We may pass over hastily some of the later experiments with dirigibles that failed. In 1834 the County Lennox built an airship 130 feet long to be driven by oars worked by man power. When the crowd that gathered to watch the ascent found that the machine was too heavy to ascend even without the men, they expressed their lively contempt for the inventor by tearing his clothes to tatters and smashing his luckless airship. In 1852 another Frenchman, Henry Giffard, built a cigar-shaped balloon 150 feet long by 40 feet in diameter, driven by steam. The engine weighed 300 pounds and generated about 3 horsepower, about 1/200th as much power as a gas engine of equal weight would produce. Even with this slender power, however, Giffard attained a speed, independent of the wind, of from 5 to 7 miles an hour, enough at least for steerage way. This was really the first practical demonstration of the possibilities of the mechanical propulsion of balloons. Several adaptations of the Giffard idea followed, and in 1883 Renard and Krebs, in a fusiform ship driven by an electric motor, attained a speed of 15 miles an hour. By this time inventive genius in all countries, save the United States, which lagged in interest in dirigibles, was stimulated. Germany and France became the great protagonists in the struggle for precedence, and in the struggle two figures stand out with commanding prominence: the Count von Zeppelin and Santos Dumont, a young Brazilian resident in Paris, who, without official countenance, consecrated his fortune to, and risked his life in, the service of aviation. End of The Earliest Flying Men, Part II. Recording by William Tomcho.